Heads up, I couldn't see you yet.
Yeah,
perfect. Sure. There we are. And now we're ready.
Out my light here, but it's not working very well. Oh well, good enough.
It looks great. So welcome everybody. We are so excited to have you in class today. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And today's topic is a fantastic and fascinating topic about the women's fight for equality in the United States, focusing on the 19th Amendment as well. So we're going to walk through a lot of American history. And to do this, our great lecture today is going to be guided, and I'm going to do my best to make sure I say your name correctly, by Professor Tetrault. See, she explained it to me earlier, and I followed directions at least for a little while. So we are so happy that you're here with us. Students, this is a true honor. We have such a brilliant mind with us today. Professor Tetrault is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, is an author of so many books, and I will drop them in the chat as we go and do a follow-up as well. A professor that has helped us so many times with our town halls, our podcasts, and our 19th Amendment exhibit at the National Constitution Center. So many great ways that you've engaged with us. Your first book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, is one that is sitting at my bedside table, and I just cracked it open the other day. I was like, I need to prep more with this, but you're also working on some new work as well. So before we dive in to a dialogue on the history of women's equality, our students also like to know about our professors and what made you go into this field and what made you really get interested in this topic. We'll start there, and then we'll dive into all the other questions that we have from the Constitution Center and our students have.
So I never thought I would do any of these things. They were never really like, that's my goal. That's what I want to do. And so I would say to students first, like, be open to detours in your life, because sometimes they take you places that you're really excited to be, but you had no idea existed. So that's kind of what happened to me. So when I was in college, I was a French major. I grew up in Iowa, and I really knew I was curious about the world. I had French heritage, which is why my last name is so funny. And I started studying French, and then I was going to, go see the world and kind of learn about the world. And I studied a bunch of other languages. And then I came back from a year abroad. And while I was overseas, while I was studying in France for a year, I had to take, as part of the program I was on, a 2-part history class, like a year-long history class. I had never chosen to take history before that, and I would not have chosen to take history. I thought it was really boring. And I thought it was about like memorizing about dead people in the past. And often, when I was in college too, it was still pretty much dead white men, when it was just starting to be about some other people. And so, history wasn't that interesting to me, but here I was living in France as a young kid who didn't know very much about the world. And every time I learned about history, everything around me made more sense. Like if I was in another cathedral, you're like, oh, great, here's another cold stone cathedral with some beautiful glass. They all look the same. And then the tour guide would start, and he'd be explaining, or she would be explaining the different architecture in this one and how the glass meant something different. And suddenly, if you knew about its history and you knew about its intent, it was like this totally different entity. And suddenly this cathedral was so different than the other cathedrals I had seen. And the same was true for everywhere I was traveling. I did a lot of traveling while I was there. And I went to places I didn't understand and I didn't know anything about. Like I went to Greece and I was like, I didn't know anything about Greek mythology. So when I came back from France, I was interested in this thing called history. And I didn't know why yet. I just knew I liked it. And I think the reason I later figured out I liked it is because history was not what I thought it was. I thought it was about like the past and about dead stuff, right? Turns out history is actually about the present, which we can talk more about today if you want, but that's what I love about history. It's actually an argument that we in the present make about what meaning is. What is our current meaning, And so then when I started thinking about history as an argument that people were making and about how we make sense of the world that we're in, which is how I was using it when I was there without really realizing it, then I started to get really interested in it. And I came back and did my last years of college, got my teaching certificate so that I could teach high school history French. And I thought, I'm still so curious about that history thing. It was so cool. And then when I got back to the US, I thought, I don't really know anything about this place. Like, what do I know about this place? So it was a long, winding road. And eventually I ended up becoming a historian. And I didn't really even mean to, except later it was just like I couldn't stop myself. So that's where we ended up. And then I'll take a break there and see if anyone wants to say that or like say anything about that. But then I could talk about the book, which was also kind of a detour and an accident. There seems to be a theme in my life, which is kind of have a rough plan and then kind of follow where it goes. But so
I love that. Yeah, I love that
like,
balance of spontaneity at the same time of letting opportunities unfold. So that's absolutely brilliant advice. And it really unbelievably powerful. I think it's really, we were just commenting in the chat, we absolutely love kind of this idea that, you know, understanding your present really is about fulfilling the understanding of the past. I always think about history. History helps us see with wider lens.
Yes.
And when we have that wider lens, we can see more and see almost, it's like that moment in Wizard of Oz where it goes from black and white to color. All of a sudden things turn on and come into life, and it is not a dead
and
past.
When you pull the curtain back on the Oz, right? And it turns out he's not the great powerful Oz.
He's not.
So yeah, it's interesting. And I think that is really, really evident right now when we look at a lot of the debates about education, and particularly critical race theory and the efforts to try to control what people can and can't learn in Florida, arguing that this is, you know, and that's all about who do we want to be in the present, right? Who are we trying to make ourselves to be in the present? What do we think matters in the present? At least those people making those arguments. And then the people fighting back say, no, this other stuff matters in the present, right? And you're diminishing us, or you're diminishing. So the thing I love about knowledge and the thing I love about history is that it's so contested and so political and so fraught with power. And that's what started to make it interesting to me. And it took me a long time to kind of understand that. Before I was just like, this is cool. Why is this cool? I don't know why this is cool, but I like it. The other thing is, like, for the students in the room, if you think about history, you probably think you just go back and then there's this story about the past and you just find out what the story is and then you read it and then you learn it and then you know the history. But when you think about it, like, think about yesterday. Think how long it would take you. It would take you all day today to tell you everything that happened yesterday, right? Because it took 24 hours. So you have to pick and choose among what happened yesterday. And when you pick and choose, you leave stuff out. You're making choices about what you want to say was important about yesterday and what wasn't important about yesterday. So everybody, and then if you just think that was your yesterday and you're not going to tell the whole story, you're just going to tell part of it. Think about when I look back at 100 years of stuff. And in the archive, not everybody is there. Only some people got their stuff kept, you know, when I go to the library and stuff. So then I have to pick and choose from the past. And so maybe I think the stories of women are the one that I want to look at. And somebody else said, no, the story of men are the ones we want to look at. And somebody else said, no, it's the story of Native Americans that we want to look at. And every time you pick one of those different stories, you tell a different story about the past, but you also tell a different story about what matters to you today, right? What meaning do you want yesterday to be about, right? So, and if you think too about like lawyers and the, you know, like think about like a trial, everybody's got the same evidence in front of them. And the people who say they're guilty say, this is how the evidence says they're guilty. And the other side said, this is how the evidence says they're innocent. So you can put the evidence together in different ways to tell different stories. And then in the end, those stories matter a lot. Somebody could go to jail or somebody could be free, right? And so that's kind of how I think about history, is like we pick and choose from the facts in the past. That doesn't mean we can like leave, you know, really, like you can't say the Holocaust didn't happen, right? That's irresponsible. Like you don't get to just pick and choose anything. But we do pick and choose. And when we do that, we make an argument about what matters, you know, to us in the present. And so it's really, it's cool to me. So I like to argue and I really like words. So history turned out to be super fun for me. And that was completely unexpected. I did not know that. And I'm just teaching my college students some stuff now. And they're like, why didn't I learn this in high school? This is so important. So.
And we hear that all the time at the center, because that's what museums do too. Everybody, you pick and choose what you tell somebody, like back in the day in a letter, we pick and choose what stories and what artifacts we tell. And so it is really important as we think about that. When you go to a museum, when you hear an author, or when you're writing your own piece, think about the stories you're choosing to amplify and elevate, and the stories you're choosing not to, and make sure you're comfortable with that. But talking about stories, the history of women in the United States is so much to unpack there. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how you came to your first book. But what I find so fascinating about teaching this topic is kind of our lack of understanding of what life was really like and what rights women just did not have in early America and in the colonial period. So I almost want to start that baseline and like start walking through time and say, so what kind of life would I have as a woman in 1776, in 1787? And could you kind of like help us understand the reality of the social structure then?
Yeah. One of the really tricky things about the field of women's history is that it's 51% of the population, right? So it's really, really hard because you have to say which women. Like if you were to say, tell me about men's history, right? That would seem like a completely incoherent category, right? Well, it depends. Which men are you talking about? The founding fathers, and the same thing's true for women's history, right? There are so many different kinds of women. And so in 1776, you would have a lot of different lives. You would have a variety of people who were now promised emancipation in the North, because after the American Civil War, the northern states put in place and gradually ending slavery. You would have indigenous women still living in this area who would be trying to figure out how are they going to navigate. This is before they've been removed to the West, and taken off of these lands. You would have people, arriving in boats who would be coming, hoping for a new life, either a religious life or an economic life, or because they were coming, with their husbands and they were mad, you would have women across the upper South, Virginia and that area, still suffering enslavement. And you would have people who sided with the British during the war and were promised emancipation if they sided with the British and they won. And then when the British lost, and even before they did, they sold everybody back into slavery. So you could have been one of those people who was deeply disillusioned by the promises of the revolution, and then you were sold back into slavery. If you were kind of a white native-born farm woman, which this was still very much a rural world, right? This was not a world of big cities or anything yet. If you were a native, like rural farm woman, you would have a life of intense labor, right? Just endless amounts of labor. You would also be birthing every other year, right? This is a world that does not have strong fertility control. So the toll on your body would be tremendous. Your life would be much shorter. The likelihood that your husbands would die would be very high. And you, if your husband died, were really in trouble if you were a white native-born farm woman, because you couldn't own anything. Like if your husband died, your house didn't belong to you. Your kids didn't belong to you. Nothing belonged to you. So in that era, you weren't thought to be a person who actually was like an equal of men who could own stuff if you were white. You were thought to be kind of the man's property, and he could do with you kind of whatever he wanted. He was allowed to beat you as long as he didn't beat you with anything bigger than his thumb. That expression, some of you may have heard it, the rule of thumb. That meant that it was fine to beat your wife or like use physical punishment as long as it wasn't excessive, as long as it wasn't bigger than your thumb. If she worked and like sold butter and made a bunch of money off that, it was all the husbands, like the woman. So you couldn't like get a bank account. You couldn't testify in court. Or you could testify in court. You couldn't like sit on juries. Sometimes you couldn't testify in court. So it was, you had a very difficult time showing up or having any rights that you could leverage against in the law. And so a lot of the places where we find people in the past is by finding them in court cases. And you find women in court cases, but only certain kinds of women were able to get before the law and all that kind of stuff. And then if you were an enslaved woman, you had no law protecting you whatsoever. There was no rule of thumb. Like bigger than the thumb was totally possible. You absolutely could not own anything. You literally, even more so, did not own your own body. You didn't own your children. They were all, you were the property of someone else. And you did even more incredibly hard labor, both of birthing and of field labor. So, it really depends who you were. But these were women who had very, very few rights, very ways to leverage anything to change their lives, and women who worked very, very hard and were generally under the control of either white men and women or a white man. So
when does this start? When does it start to get change? And how do women with so few rights? And again, thank you so much for kind of like layering that, because there's a difference between women in this time period. It's not all lump. And we will see that through the whole history, that there is, we can't just say the women's movement or this. You have to break that out into all the different areas and all the different sections. So thank you for starting that like early on in our travels through time. But when did traction start to happen and why?
So again, there's no one answer to that question. There's no one answer to any of these questions because all women's lives are different. And one of the things we choose to do in the present, if we answer that with a single question, is prioritize the lives of white middle-class people. And that's not something I want to do in the present, right? Because, so there's no, when did that idea get traction? It got traction in 1776, and it got traction before 1776. So if you go all the way to the very top echelons of American society and look at John Adams, who was one of the founding fathers, helped draft the Constitution, helped draft the Articles of Confederation, becomes the second president of the United States. His wife was already arguing with him about whether or not there were going to be rights for women in the Constitution. If you men don't have to be governed by kings, why do I have to be governed by my husband? And so right away, when the Revolutionary Fathers started arguing they didn't have to be ruled by kings, a lot of other people came along and said, and I don't have to be ruled by you. And you can see that the founding fathers were really worried that there were all these people who were arguing they didn't have to be ruled anymore. And they're trying to put the lid back on it, So there were lots of slave revolts in this era. People arguing, there were lots of people siding with the British to try to, end slavery in this era. There were lots of still treaties and negotiations with indigenous women who generally had all the different indigenous nations. Remember, being an indigenous American wasn't even one thing in this era. It was like many, many things. And there were lots and lots of different Indian nations, and they all had very different gender practices. And so some of those women were busy deciding, what they were going to do about their lands. A lot of those women in some of the native communities got to control what happened with land. And as there was land incursion, they got to decide who gets to live where. And so, some people were making those decisions, and they were trying to figure out how are their communities going to survive, right? And then there were people who were domestic servants for people who lived, who were striving to try to get out of those situations and find a way to have economic control over their life. So there were so many different ways in which people were pushing to try to control or, get rights. And I would say that it starts right in 1776.
So it's amazing and powerful. And thank you so much, because we have a Wednesday class that we do at 12 and 2 at these same topics, and it's with our NCC team. And that was one of the questions that the student had, was how reflective of is this coverture idea on women of other nations? And so that it's really fascinating to look at.
It's irrelevant for them. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really powerful. And this is the same, the same landmass and completely different structures. I guess how much, and we were talking about this around World War II and World War I, but how much leading up to the Civil War do we start to see this kind of change for some women in our country to get more rights and gain more?
You desperately want me to talk about the women's movement, but I'm going to refuse to do it.
I don't actually. I just want to see where can we start to see ticking and steps moving forward to say we're broadening some rights and
So
around
people, I
this.
mean, when you're telling the story of white native born women, which should not stand in for the history of women, nor should stand in for the history of women's rights. It's only one version of women's rights. There were lots of other women who said that agenda is not relevant to me, right? I have this agenda over here. We just don't prioritize telling those stories if you're a white middle class, white native born person. So, in 1776, one of the things that white middle class women got, because they were arguing we want rights, was they got the right to education. Women's education expanded dramatically after 1776, but women's education only for some people. But literacy increases dramatically after the American Revolution. The idea is if we're going to govern ourselves, we have to have a literate, population, the ones that we deem, part of our polis, which was not everybody that was there, physically there. So education grows dramatically. And I think there's a real argument to be made that education is the core of resistance, right? Without education, it's very difficult to mount resistance. And I think that you can argue that maybe one of the first steps was just gaining literacy and gaining the ability to craft manifestos and gaining the ability to, push back against the logic of other people and make your words understood powerfully through texts and through speeches. And that will be such an important piece of emancipation after the American Civil War too, right? We must get literacy. I mean, it was one of the central tenets, because literacy and education is so central to your ability to control your life. So I would, I think there's so much that happens in 1776, but if you want me to talk about, I think you're pushing me to talk about the so-called rise of a women's movement, which of course I demolish in my book, but but anyway, go ahead.
I am just more interested in a timeline that my brain wraps everything around.
There isn't a timeline though. It depends on who. We can't just say women. We always have to say which women. So
yeah. I think
there is no single timeline. It would be like saying for men, what's men's timeline?
No, I just mean moving forward in time. Like, okay, jump 10 years. But before we go on that timeline venture, who are some of the people we should know that, and we like to talk about in this class all the time, who are the people we don't know about? Like we talk so often about telling history and, who picked that story? What are the stories we're missing? So we like to share in these classes. Yeah. We're missing so many classes. And that's what we love, because we get obsessed every month about a new set of people that we should have been, and that we slightly get annoyed with how come I didn't learn about this person before this? So who are some of those people that you would say, here are the 5 people you should know by the end of, your reading after this class?
Yeah. Wow. Just 5. I mean, there's so many.
You can go more than 5.
And biographies are a really nice way to bring in a lot of the complexity, right? Because then instead of trying to generalize, you can specialize, and you can talk about all the complexity and the difference across women's lives. I mean, think about trying to create a single narrative for men. You couldn't do it. You can't for women either. But so maybe to start with, do people know Deborah Sampson? She's somewhat famous now, but I don't know. Is that somebody the students would know? How many people know Deborah Sampson? You guys write in on I'm still sticking around in 1776. I don't know why, but
it's all right. You stay there. I will not shove you forward.
It's funny. It's like completely not my era, but for some reason I'm like sticking there. So Kimberly does not know Deborah Sampson. Does anyone else want to know who she is? So Deborah Sampson was one of the many cross-dressing soldiers. She was a woman who cross-dressed as a man and fought in the American Revolution, and took a pension afterwards, and lived successfully as a man some of the time. So there were a lot of cross-dressing people, and she was one of them. And we'll have plenty during the American Civil War too. And of course, if you're someone who supports trans rights right now, you would say, I'm not a novelty in the present. I've been around forever, right? And so, you would argue, I have a history, therefore I have a right to exist in the present, right? That's how I was trying to tie that. Another person I would probably pick would be people that you're probably familiar with, but the Grimke sisters. I'm a huge fan of the Grimke sisters. Should I go, or are they too familiar?
No, please. I think some of us here at the center know them because you ensured that they were in the exhibit at the 19th Amendment. So thank you for that.
So the Grimke sisters, yay, abolitionists, I know. And the Grimke sisters are great because they actually live their credo. Some abolitionists were like, yes, we're against slavery, but the whole equality of Black people, I don't know. So the Grimke sisters came from a South Carolina slave-owning family, grew up there, and then moved north in the 1820s to figure out what was God's proper teaching. So there was a whole religious revival in this period, and the only way you could get to heaven is if you figured out the right path to heaven. So they were part of this, and they went north, they joined various churches, they ended up joining the Quakers, and then they ended up deciding that, in fact, slavery was a sin against God. And they went out and they started speaking against slavery. And this was outrageous because not only were you not allowed to own anything, you weren't really allowed to be out in the public in this era if you were a woman. Your goal was to stay in the home if you were a white, native-born woman. And men's job was to be out in the public. And women's job was to be quiet. And men's job was to be loud and boisterous. So they go out and start lecturing around the country, particularly in the North. There's a price on their head in the South, and there are puppets of them burned and things like that. And men start sneaking into their lectures because they want to hear what they have to say about slavery, because these are two people who have actually witnessed it. And that creates a scandal, and they're attacked by the church for having preached to mixed sex audiences, which is like, Elvis swinging his hips on the Ed Sullivan Show or something. That'll be a reference that only some people will get. And then, they just go on and do incredible things. Then they get attacked, right, for being women speaking against slavery out loud. And then they start writing women's rights defenses. And so Sarah will author in the 1920s letters on the equality of the sexes, right, arguing that the sexes actually each have a moral obligation before God to engage in social activity and social improvement. And then as they move on in their lives, they will also, which is very rare, identify with their biracial relatives. So it was very, very common for slave masters to assault their enslaved people and birth children through them as a way of increasing their capital. And so they went down and got their nephews out of enslavement in the South, their biracial nephews, whom their brother had fathered, but didn't claim as children. But they knew they were his children, and they brought them north and they got them educated, and they gave them, and one of them would go on to become one of the first Black graduates of Harvard. He'll become one of the most important Black ministers and Black preachers, Archibald Grimke. He will then have a daughter that will become incredibly important as part of the 1930s and 1920s Harlem Renaissance, and she will write the first play by an African-American woman, and she'll be named Angelina after her great aunt. Angelina Grimke Weld. Or Angelina Weld, I can't remember. But so that's just like a fascinating family, right? And it also tells us a lot about the difference of families and women and the ways in which people were implicated across this institution of slavery and not just severed by it.
Okay, so now
I don't know. That's two.
That's awesome. Now we're going to play the name game because everybody's excited about. So Anne, can you tell us a story about Anne Hutchinson? I'm putting.
Oh yeah, that's going way back.
Yeah, and so we were in this time period, and I found her. I feel like I don't know enough about her, but the little that I did know, I found her pretty bold and impressive.
Oh yeah, she is. So there was a sense when the Puritans came over, right? Because there are also lots of religious people coming over, right? We've got the Pilgrims that we always think of, but there's lots of religious dissenters coming over, hoping to find a place where they can practice their religion without oppression or interference. But all these men in Puritanism claimed that they owned the ability to control and read the scripture. And remember, a lot of women can't read either, so they can't read the scripture and be authorities on it. And Anne Hutchinson decides that, in fact, these men are improperly interpreting the scripture. And so she starts to lead a breakaway sect that argues that women do have a place. There's also a whole religious background that I'm not going to get into. It's antinomianism, and she starts arguing that women have an equality before God, and that they can interpret scripture, and that these men are actually interpreting it incorrectly. And she gets expelled. What's the word? Expulsed. That's not the word though. expelled.
Expelled.
She gets expelled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right, for like a religious heresy. And she breaks away and she moves into, I think, Rhode Island. Rhode Island ends up being this place where all these religious dissidents go. They're like the dissidents from the dissidents, right? And she leads a kind of breakaway group of religious people, and then she is killed in a raid by the indigenous community, who was also upset that they're there. They're like, this is not your territory, right? And she's eventually, so it's just like, she's another fascinating character, right? Who argues, I have the right to autonomy and to authority and to, and she argues that she understands the word of God better than these men. So.
Fantastic. And now, Mary Walker. I don't know anything about Mary Walker, so I can't even help you go there.
Another cross-dresser. Mary Walker is a doctor. She's Dr. Mary Walker. She trains us, but I'm not sure. It was really hard at this point. There wasn't like formal medical training. You may know that Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to graduate from medical school in the US in the 1830s. But Dr. Mary Walker was, she worked during the American Civil War, kind of as, providing medical care and troop care and things like that. And then after the war, for reasons, that were unique to her, she decided to dress in all male attire. And remember, this is the era when women, at least respectable middle-class white women are wearing, it's the Victorian era. They're wearing like dresses up to here and sleeves down to here and petticoats out, 8 feet. And Mary Walker dresses in pants and a suit coat. And I don't think you can understand how scandalous this was in the era. And she cuts her hair short. And she's a suffragist. And she advocates for women's emancipation and women's equality and for women's professional lives and a variety of other things. But Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton cannot stand her. In their letters, they're like, oh, she's at this meeting again. What are we going to do to contain her? She's so annoying. And she has arguments that are different than theirs, right? And they have no patience for this. She thinks they ought to take an entirely different legal strategy. And so she keeps writing things like trying to tell them, like, you people have it all wrong. You should listen to me. And so she's a suffragist. She goes on and, is a kind of a fly in the ointment for Stanton and Anthony for a very long time. But she's a very important reformer and, provider of aid for the troops. And and she also becomes kind of a famous person in her era just for kind of who she is. She dresses in male attire, which was very unusual in the era, but doesn't identify as male. So
yeah, probably really well known, but I was saying before class started, I love Ida B. Wells. Can you?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
We could just do a whole class on her.
Yeah, Ida B. Wells. I mean, okay, so there's a bunch of stuff that just came out about Ida B. Wells. So I would recommend everybody go do it. One is a kind of classroom accessible book, and kind of accessible for young people as well, called it's by Ida. No, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I'm blanking on this. By Michelle Duster.
Voice of Truth?
It's by Michelle Duster,
Okay,
and I'm blanking on the name of her for some reason, but that's her great granddaughter, and she just wrote a kind of accessible book for everyone about her great grandmother, to help keep her memory alive. So you should find that. It's been winning, on Best Book Prize. There's also a really, really good American Experience from PBS from back in the 90s with Toni Morrison reading her words, called Ida B. the Queen. There it is. Thank you. There's also called Passion for Justice. So The Passion for Justice is a really good, like 45-minute documentary about her that I highly recommend watching. And it's got Toni Morrison reading Ida B. Wells's words. I show my students it and they're like, how did I not know about this woman? She is she is the child of formerly enslaved parents who die in the 1860s of yellow fever, I think it is, or one of the diseases that would rip through. And she has multiple siblings, and she knows that one of the most important things to emancipated families was that their families stay together and they not get torn apart, because that's what slavery had done to them. So she disguises her age and goes out and gets a job as a teacher, because this is the era when everyone's trying to open schools to educate freed people. So she holds her family together. She gets a job as a teacher. She's working as a teacher. And then she starts becoming kind of a journalist. She starts writing for the Black Press of Memphis, Tennessee. And she realizes that white people are just issuing lie after lie after lie about African Americans. And she takes it upon herself to just keep writing these lies, right? Like, you said this happened, that, in the past, this Black person did that. And so you're now using that as a way to oppress them in the present. Well, you're lying. They didn't do that. And your oppression in the present is wrong, right? Again, to go to the way the past and present interline. So she starts exposing all kinds of white lies, including the reasons behind lynching. There are 3 of her friends who get lynched because they were starting to run successful Black businesses, and that was threatening the white business that was their rival. And they're lynched on a charge of assault, which is what most Black men were lynched upon, even though it was almost never true. And she knows it's not true. And she writes a bunch of stuff exposing the white men who did this. And then there's a price on her head, and she's chased out of Tennessee. Because she's going to be executed if she leaves Tennessee. And she goes to Chicago, where she continues to be a journalist, and she becomes one of the most badass anti-lynching and civil rights crusaders you've ever seen in your life. Like this, I can't even imagine having the steel of spine and like the grace and dignity and strength and intellect that this woman had. But she goes on to do all kinds of amazingly important work. And she's also, she organizes Black women to vote in Chicago. Before the 19th Amendment is passed, they get municipal suffrage. And she organizes Black women to vote, and she gets the first Black alderperson elected in Chicago. And then he will go on to become one of the only Black men in Congress in the 1930s through the activists of Black women. So she leverages everything. She's just incredible. There's not enough you can say about Ida B. Wells.
Okay, last person, and then we'll fall to Kimberly's questions, and then we'll wrap it up. But this is so hard because this is so much fun. We love just telling stories about people. Little off center, but so much of her work around kind of debunking the myth of race is Zora Neale Hurston. So yeah. I think she is not respected in the history community and the science community. And I'm reading this book, it's something about the sun. I always forget it. The 5 rogue anthropologists that broke the race tradition. It's a really cool book. I don't
know that book. Find the title of it and stick it in. I'm curious what it is. Yeah,
really fascinating. I mean, all the women in it are pretty amazing, but just this moment in world history and debunking the lie. It's Margaret Mead is one of the other women in the book too. Yeah. So Margaret Mead, Zora Neale Hurston, throw it at us.
I'm just responding to the domesticity question, which we can refer to in a minute. So Zora Neale Hurston, also descended from recently emancipated people, born in the late part of the 1800s, and she becomes a student of the African-American culture. And I think she's at the age where she's starting to realize that the people who had been enslaved are starting to pass away, and, who had come out of freedom. And also that her people are a magnificent people with a culture and a heritage that has never been recorded because they were enslaved, right? And so white people didn't keep records about Black people. And so part of what she does is exactly what I'm arguing, history is about, is making meaning. And she says, for the dignity and the love of my people to be recognized, we need to document their traditions and their lives and for us to have a history of ourselves so that we can know who we are. And so she becomes an anthropologist essentially, and goes around and documents. And then she gets funding to do this through the New Deal. Because the New Deal actually had people go around and do oral histories and stuff like that. Like that was the way they employed people. And she was a novelist as well. She would write a lot of novels. And she went around and she documented Black life, both with a tape recorder and with interviews and with writing down songs, for example, that came out of slavery that had never been written down. And she created just this incredible, rich archive for the African-American experience. And she was a novelist. And she was just so highly respected. in her time. And then one of the really interesting things that happens is that she gets forgotten. And the person who I think of as recovering her, and this is how I learned about Zora Neale Hurston in grad school, is Alice Walker. Alice Walker in the 1970s cool. Discovers, as women's studies is starting to build up in universities in the 1970s, she's kind of like, who are my foremothers? Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton have nothing to do with me, right? So if we're going to build women's studies, like those are your foremothers, who are my foremothers? And she goes back and she finds the fiction of Zora Neale Hurston, and then she has this beautiful essay in Our Mother's Gardens, which is a collection of her essays from the 1970s. Going to find Zora Neale Hurston's grave and finding that it's essentially abandoned and nobody even bothered to, and she sort of claims and recovers her as her foremother. And Zora Neale Hurston has been kind of in the process of rehabilitation as a really important archivist and carrier of the story of African descended peoples and the glory and the beauty of their own culture. So
it's unbelievably powerful. And I'm trying to find, there's a really good resources that you can use with students, and learners of all ages can see the imagery too, because there were photographers that went with them.
Yeah, because there would be there'd be photographers, really there'd be recorders. Yeah, and there's a lot of it's digitized, so you can use it in the classroom, and it's just amazing stuff. She also they also just published a book of hers that was meant to be published and never got published, called Barracoon, which is about the last living known person to have crossed over on a slave ship. That just came out in the last couple of years, and it was her manuscript, but it had never been published. So
wow, it's powerful. I also just found it powerful to understand how to do an interview with somebody who has lived through such amazing history and experiences. Like learning the interview process by what she did was really powerful, like the skills and the output.
And there were a lot of oral historians during the New Deal that were white that went down to try to also document. But you can imagine African Americans are not going to speak to white people the way they're going to talk to Zora Neale Hurston. And they're also not going to know to ask about songs and stuff like that, right? They're going to ask about the stuff white people are preoccupied with. So Zora Neale Hurston, it's invaluable what she did.
There's a newer series, High on the Hog, if anybody has seen that.
Oh, I've seen it, yeah.
And it does that kind of like, let's go to this moment, let's capture this history, but also, part of that history is also, it's the songs, it's the spoken word, it's also the food and all those pieces. So it reminded me of her, and like going back, and that's why I got the book, because I was like, wait a minute, I need to reopen this chapter of
absolutely
history.
And realizing that all of that is culture too, right? Food, like if you don't have the ability to produce a masterpiece of literature because you're enslaved, right? Like food and quilting and things like that are rich masterpieces of culture. So yeah.
Oh, that's powerful. And really to think about it, if you're denied the right to be able to read, to be able to write, how do you show your brilliance? And you show it in what you do in other ways. That's absolutely powerful. Okay.
Right. Songs were incredibly powerful. And in music, African Americans have, often led most of the musical innovations in this country, right? I mean, the blues, how do you, so.
Okay, we will end with Kimberly's question. Can you find fault in the advancement of women's rights in conjunction with the breakdown of the family unit? Do you think the advancement of women in our culture has come at the cost of the family unit?
So this is a huge debate, and I can tell you what I think, but of course it's not the answer. The answer depends on what each of us wants to interpret. So part of what feminism, if we think about kind of mainstream white feminism of the 1970s and the 1960s, argued for was the right for women to be able to go out and get jobs, right? And a lot of Black women are like, I've been working since slavery. I would like the chance to have some leisure, but anyway, so go out and get jobs. But the thing is, women do so much inside the household. It is a full-time job. Anybody who's run a household knows how much labor it is. And so when they went out and got those things, what they also argued was, we should both share earning and we should also both share domesticity. We should share the domestic chores. Or there have been women in time who have argued things like, there's a really cool group of women in a book, and I can't think of any of their names. Speaking of women we never knew, but Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, would have been, her book Women in Economics makes this argument. And there's a book by Dolores Hayden called grand domestic revolution. That's what it is. And at the turn of the century, as we started to get like rationalization of factories, like we should run factories in a very efficient fashion and one person to work on this, and, like the Ford assembly line and things like that, started saying that to housework. Why should we have, 1,000 women in this apartment block all making dinner at the same time? Doesn't that seem like a lot of duplication of labor? And so they started arguing for collectivizing domestic labor, that you have one person in the building, or 12 people whose job is to take care of all the kids in the building, or whose job is to do the cooking for the whole building or whatever. So the thing is, I think we think of the family unit as both a moral center, but the thing is, it's also a labor center. And so a lot of the question has been like, how do we maintain the labor that family does if the woman wants to go off and do other things, because she's still considered responsible for all that labor. And then generally, if that labor doesn't get done, then there's a kind of moral condemnation, or a sense that that woman has broken down the kind of moral fiber of that family. And those are open debates. I myself feel like everyone should be able to kind of, find a path to meaning and self-determination, and that we should elevate the role of labor inside a household such that more people take responsibility for doing it, and we make it more visible, because I feel like it's also invisible labor that is culturally lauded, but not factually like reinforced. There was a whole movement. Did you know? This is also something you probably didn't know. There was a whole movement of older white women during the 1970s women's movement to get the federal government or some entity to pay women for domestic labor. What they argued was, we like doing domestic labor. We want to do domestic labor, right? But we think this is valuable labor that should be seen as labor and should be reimbursed. Like, I should be earning a salary for what I do, and there's an interesting article about that. So there's so many ways to think about the family as a labor unit, but then also as a kind of a moral center of our, the way a Christian universe centers the family. And that really relies on women staying and doing a lot of labor. And so, you have to think about what the costs and the benefits of that are.
This has been an unbelievably powerful class. I've absolutely loved it. It's been probably one of my favorites, because we are really talking about these amazing stories that we don't know. And I love that you started us off with, every time I learn more in history, the things around me start to make more sense. Mm-hmm. And so that has been unbelievably powerful. But I think I am going to rename this class Women's History in America, Something or Someone You Did Not Know. And I think that's
a good way to do it. Yeah. Rather than here's a timeline, because who are we talking about?
It's so much more powerful, and also more interesting, because we come to the table sharing names that we may have heard of or didn't hear of, but really to make it make more sense to us as we move forward and to see things in a new lens. Mm-hmm. It's about what we don't know and a structure that we don't understand. So thank you so much. This has been really, really fun. Yeah. Great conversation. Students have all had fun. And students, remember, I will make sure we do a class roundup at the end of the week, send you this video as well as all the links. I was crazy dropping in there since I know it's hard to follow. And we will get even more in there. But Professor, thank you so much for being with us
today. And for all the kids here, pay attention to all the work that goes on inside your house. Like, think when you go to take a shower, there's a clean towel, or maybe there's a clean towel. When you go to the bathroom, there's usually some toilet paper. Usually somehow there's some food in the house. Usually you get to the dentist. Like, somebody does all that work. So doesn't just magically appear.
List it out by the adults in your house and make it.
There's a really great, if anyone wants to read this piece, you can just Google it. It's called Why I Want a Wife by Judy Cyphers Brady. But it details kind of all the labor that women do. So
fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for spending your time. Hope there's stuff you can take away. Be well.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. This was fantastic. I'm going to do the official